The war had lasted for many years, and no side was willing to stop. Both empires sent armies to the front lines again and again. Fields were burned, cities were ruined, and soldiers marched without rest. The commanders on both sides wanted victory at any cost, and they cared little for the lives lost. In the middle of this endless struggle was Captain Ethan Cross. He had fought since he was young, and he had seen more battles than most men could endure. His name carried weight among his soldiers, for he was brave and never left a man behind. On one cold morning, his unit was sent on a dangerous mission. Their orders were clear. They had to strike deep into enemy land, destroy a hidden supply depot, and then retreat before the enemy could gather. The march was long and the ground was rough, but Ethan pushed his men forward. They reached the stronghold before the sun had risen high. It was hidden inside a valley, guarded by watchtowers and steel gates. Ethan gave the signal, and the attack began. Gunfire cracked through the air. Explosions shook the ground. The enemy rushed out to defend their depot, but Ethan's men fought with fury. Smoke filled the valley, and fire spread from one building to the next. The stronghold was breaking under the assault. But amid the fight, Ethan saw something that stopped him in his tracks. From the corner of his eye, he spotted movement inside a ruined hall. At first he thought it was another soldier, but when he looked closer, he saw a young woman pinned under a fallen steel beam. Her face was pale, her hands bloody as she struggled to push the beam away. The battle raged all around her, yet no one came to help. Ethan felt his chest tighten. She was not dressed as a soldier. She wore the robe of high rank, and even in her state, it was clear she was someone important. He rushed forward, ignoring the bullets that struck the walls near him. His men shouted his name, but he did not stop. When he reached her side, he dropped his rifle and pushed with all his strength. The steel beam did not move at first. Dust stung his eyes and pain shot through his arms. But he pressed harder until the weight shifted and the woman gasped in relief. Ethan pulled her free and held her steady as she tried to stand. She was weak, her leg bleeding, but alive. She looked at him with wide eyes. For a moment, she seemed shocked that he would save her. Ethan did not speak. He only lifted her into his arms and carried her away from the collapsing hall. Fire rose high behind them and the ceiling gave way. If he had come a minute later, she would have been lost forever. As he carried her, one of his men ran up to him. The soldier's voice shook with disbelief. He told Ethan who the young woman was. It was Clara, the daughter of Queen Alira, ruler of the enemy empire. Her capture or death could change the war itself. Commanders on his side had spoken many times about how the queen's daughter was untouchable, hidden far from the front. And now here she was, alive in Ethan's arms. The weight of the moment pressed heavy on him. He had not planned it. He had not thought about who she was. He only saw a person in need and acted. Now both armies would hear of this. His men looked at him with mixed eyes, some proud and some fearful. They knew saving her could bring reward, but it could also bring wrath. Still, Ethan did not waver. He carried Clara through the smoke, protecting her from falling debris, until they reached the edge of the valley. When the raid was over and the depot lay in ruins, Ethan's soldiers gathered around him. They whispered of what had happened, their words filled with unease. Clara sat beside a broken wall, her wound bandaged, her eyes locked on Ethan. She spoke softly, telling him she owed him her life. Ethan gave no reply, only a silent nod. He knew the truth. This act would not be forgotten by either side. The Queen would learn of it soon, and the war would change in ways no one could yet see. News of the raid spread faster than fire on dry grass. Both armies heard the same story within a day. Captain Ethan Cross had saved Clara, the daughter of Queen Alira. Some said he had captured her. Others claimed he had betrayed his orders, but the truth was stranger. He had pulled her from death when the stronghold collapsed and carried her to safety. Now the fate of two empires was tied to one man's decision on a battlefield. When the army returned to camp, Ethan was summoned at once. His commanders gathered in the war tent, their faces tight with anger. They demanded to know why he had saved her. They told him he should have left her behind or taken her as a prisoner at once. Ethan stood silent, letting their words wash over him. He knew they were afraid, not of Clara herself, but of what her mother would do. He had touched something sacred to the enemy. He had done what no soldier from their side had dared. At the same time, word reached Queen Alira. Her court fell into shock. No enemy had ever come so close to her family, and none had ever shown mercy. When she heard her daughter lived because of Ethan, her anger did not fade as many expected. Instead, she sent riders with a single message to Ethan's army. She did not demand her daughter's return. She demanded Ethan himself. The camp shook with uproar when the message was read aloud. Officers cursed and shouted. Some called it a trap. Others believed the queen wished to kill Ethan slowly before her people. Ethan listened without speaking. He looked around the tent and saw fear in the eyes of men who had seen too much war. To them, he had placed them in danger by saving Clara. To him, it was not so simple. He had seen her face when he lifted the beam. She had not been a symbol of power. She had been a young woman about to die. The High Commander ordered that the Queen's demand be rejected, said no soldier of their army would ever be handed over, but he also ordered Ethan to remain in camp and not leave his post. Guards were placed near his tent, not to protect him, but to make sure he stayed. The commander knew if Ethan crossed the lines, the Queen might gain something greater than a prisoner. She might gain a hero. That night, the camp was restless. Soldiers whispered around fires, some admiring Ethan for his courage, others calling him a fool. Clara was kept in a guarded tent, her wound treated, but she was not treated as a prisoner. She asked to see Ethan, and when he came, she looked at him with calm eyes. She told him her mother had sent for him, and she believed her mother would not harm him. Ethan asked her why, and she answered that her mother was not one to forget debts. She said he had given her back her life, and her mother would not ignore that. Ethan sat in silence for a long time. He thought of his home, his men, and the years of fighting that had bled the land dry. He thought of the queen who ruled with fire, and of the daughter who had almost died under broken steel. Then he thought of the message sent across the war lines. The queen did not want her daughter back. She wanted him. The weight of that truth pressed down on him more than any command he had ever received. Before dawn the next day, the queen's riders returned. This time, they did not come with words, but with a warning. If Ethan did not come to her fortress by sunset, she would unleash her armies on the borders and strike without mercy. It was a clear threat, but hidden inside it was something strange. She was willing to risk more war just to take one man into her hands. The High Commander raged when the warning was delivered. He ordered the camp to prepare for battle. But Ethan made his choice in that moment. He could not let thousands die for him, walked past the guards at his tent, past the soldiers who watched in silence, and he left the camp without fear. Clara followed him with her eyes as he went, her face unreadable, yet she knew the path he had chosen. He would walk into the Queen's land, not as a prisoner dragged by chains, but as a man who chose his own fate. Ethan crossed the lines at dawn, walking with steady steps. While enemy soldiers watched from the shadows of the trees, they did not strike him down, though their hands rested on their weapons. Word had already spread through the ranks that the Queen herself wanted him brought alive. He was guided along rough roads, past broken villages, and through ruined fields until at last the great fortress of Queen Alira rose before him. Its stone walls stood tall and wide, and banners of her rule flew above the gates. The gates opened with a deep sound, and soldiers in black armor led him inside. Their eyes held mistrust, but they did not touch him. The fortress was filled with movement, messengers hurrying across the courtyards, smiths hammering steel, and guards watching every corner. Yet in the center of all this noise, Ethan felt calm. He had faced death many times, and he knew fear would not serve him now. He was led through tall halls where torches burned bright against the stone. At the far end, the doors of the throne room stood open. Inside, Queen Alira sat on a high seat, her crown of iron glinting in the firelight. Her eyes were sharp, her face stern, but she did not look at him with hate. Instead, she studied him with the cold interest of someone weighing a man's worth. Ethan stopped before her, standing tall though he was alone among enemies. The hall was filled with her generals and advisors, their voices low as they spoke about him. Some wanted him executed. Others warned that he was too dangerous to keep alive. Queen Alira raised her hand and silence filled the room. She asked Ethan why he had saved her daughter. Her voice was strong, carrying through the chamber. Ethan answered with plain words. He told her he did not think of empires or crowns when he saw Clara. He saw a person trapped and dying, said no soldier in his heart would walk away from that. His words were simple, but they struck the hall like steel against stone. Many of her men sneered at him, but Clara, who stood near her mother, stepped forward. She told them that his words were true. She had seen the fire and the falling steel, and she had felt his arms carry her to safety. Without him, she would be dead. Queen Alira's eyes never left Ethan's face. After a long pause, she spoke again. She declared that he would not be returned to his army. He was not a prisoner, but he would not be free to leave. She said he had saved her bloodline, and in return, he would remain under her protection. Her words stirred unease in the hall. Generals whispered of danger, fearing that the queen placed trust in an enemy. But her command was law, and none dared oppose her openly. The queen then set a task before Ethan. She said words meant little unless proven by action. She ordered that he enter the proving ground, a place where warriors were tested by combat. If he wished to live under her roof, he had to show that his strength matched his claims of honor. Clara tried to protest, saying he had already risked enough, but her mother silenced her with a look. Ethan accepted without hesitation. He had nothing but his courage, and he would not show weakness. Guards led him through corridors to an iron gate. Beyond it lay the proving ground, a wide circle of stones surrounded by high walls and filled with sand darkened by old blood. Crowds gathered to watch from above, soldiers and courtiers eager to see the enemy captain fight. Ethan stood in the center, his hand tight on the sword given to him. From the other side, 3 warriors stepped forward, each larger than him, their armor heavy and their blades sharp. The gate closed behind them, and the trial began. The first warrior charged fast, swinging his blade with all his strength. Ethan moved aside, using speed instead of force, and struck back with a sharp cut across the man's arm. The warrior stumbled, blood staining the sand. The second came next, a towering fighter with a hammer that shook the ground with each swing. Ethan kept his distance, striking quick and retreating before the hammer could land. The crowd roared as dust rose high. The third warrior circled, waiting for the right moment to strike. Ethan's breath grew heavy, but his will stayed strong. He fought with every skill he had learned in years of war, using cunning instead of raw power. When the second warrior slowed from his own heavy swings, Ethan moved in and drove his blade across the gap in the armor. The man fell to his knees. The third warrior rushed forward in rage, but Ethan turned fast, catching him with a thrust that sent him crashing to the ground. When the fight ended, Ethan stood alone in the circle, blood on his arms, but victory in his stance. The crowd shouted in disbelief. The queen rose from her seat, her face unreadable, yet her eyes burned with a new light. He had proven himself, not only in words, but in combat. As the gate opened, and he walked back into the fortress, Ethan knew his path was set. He was no longer just a soldier of his empire. He had become something far more dangerous in the eyes of all who watched him. The proving ground had changed the way the court looked at Ethan. Men who once whispered of killing him now spoke in hushed tones of his strength. He had stood against 3 warriors of the queen and walked away alive, yet victory did not bring him freedom. It only placed him deeper inside the fortress walls. Queen Alira declared that he would remain among her people, watched by many eyes, judged by every step he took. She told her court that any man who wished to question his worth should face him in the circle. None answered. Ethan was given a chamber high in the fortress, stone walls with narrow windows looking out over the land. Soldiers guarded the doors day and night, though not once did they try to chain him. Food was brought, and his wounds from the fight were treated with skill. Still he felt the weight of being both guest and prisoner. Could walk the halls, but every gaze followed him. He was a man alone, far from his comrades, and deep in the heart of his enemy's stronghold. Clara came to him often. Her leg was still healing, but she walked with quiet strength. She thanked him again for saving her, and asked him why he had not yielded in the circle. Then told her the truth. Said he had fought many wars and seen many men fall. He could not live with himself if he had shown weakness, not when all eyes were watching. Clara listened, her face calm, but her eyes shone with something deeper. She said her mother was hard and proud, but she valued men who stood without fear. She believed Ethan had earned a place her mother would never grant to any other enemy. The queen watched him from a distance. She called him to the council chamber, where maps of the land covered the walls, and her generals debated the next strike. They fell silent when Ethan entered. The queen asked him what his army would do next, and he refused to betray his homeland. His answer was plain: he would not give her the secrets of his people. The generals raged, calling him stubborn and foolish, but the queen silenced them. She said she wanted his mind, not his betrayal. She wanted to see if he was a man who could think as well as fight. So she placed him in the training yard with her soldiers. Day after day, Ethan sparred with men who hated him, men who struck with all their strength. He fought with control, never yielding, never lashing out in blind rage. He corrected mistakes when he saw them, even in those who wished him harm. Soon whispers spread that the enemy captain fought with honor, and even taught their young recruits how to stand firm in battle. Slowly, respect began to grow, though many still distrusted him. One evening, as the sun set behind the fortress walls, Ethan walked the stone paths near the gardens. Clara found him there and told him a warning. Not all of her mother's court accepted him. She said some generals believed he would bring ruin if he stayed. They plotted in secret, whispering plans to remove him from the queen's sight. Ethan listened, but showed no fear. He told Clara he had faced many enemies, and if more came, he would stand as he always had. She looked at him with worry, but she also saw that nothing could shake his resolve. The test came sooner than expected. A feast was held in the great hall, banners flying and music echoing across the stone. The queen sat on her high seat, Clara at her side, and Ethan placed where all could see him. Wine flowed, meat was carved, and men tried to laugh, though tension lay heavy in the air. Suddenly, one of the generals rose, his face red with drink and fury. He accused Ethan of being a spy, of seeking to win trust only to strike when no one expected. The hall erupted in shouts. The queen demanded silence, but the general would not stop. He drew his blade and called Ethan to face him before all. Ethan stood at once, calm though danger burned in every eye. He took the sword offered to him and stepped into the center of the hall. The general lunged with reckless power, his strikes wild and full of anger. Ethan met him with control, each move measured, each counter sharp. Steel rang through the hall as the fight stretched on. At last, Ethan disarmed the general and sent his blade clattering across the floor. He placed his own edge at the man's throat, but did not strike. Instead, he stepped back and let the silence speak for him. The queen rose to her feet. Her voice cut through the hall like a blade. She declared that Ethan had faced both the circle and the hall, and had proved himself twice over. She warned that any who still doubted him could test him with their own blood, but she would not hear another word against him. No man answered. Clara's eyes shone with relief as Ethan lowered his sword. Yet inside him, he knew the struggle was far from over. Respect had been won, but envy and fear still lingered in the shadows of the fortress. The queen's hall had fallen silent after Ethan defeated the general, but silence did not mean peace. Whispers carried through the fortress, dark and dangerous. Some soldiers now respected Ethan, yet others hated him even more. They believed he was a shadow waiting to strike, a threat that would break the queen's power if left unchecked. In secret chambers, the bitter men gathered, their voices low, but their plans sharp. They agreed that to break the queen's trust in Ethan, they must strike at what she valued most. Clara noticed the change before anyone else. Guards who once nodded to her now turned away. Men spoke in hushed voices when she entered the halls. She felt the weight of unseen eyes following her steps. One evening, she warned Ethan that something was wrong. She told him she feared the generals would not stop until he was destroyed. Ethan listened, but showed no sign of fear. He had walked through death many times, and he knew danger best when it hid in shadows. Days passed, and then the storm came. The queen was away in council with her advisors, her attention fixed on the borders. Clara walked alone through the garden paths, the night air cool and still. But she was not alone for long. Figures slipped from the dark, cloaked and armed, moved with the silence of men who had killed before. Clara froze when she saw the steel glint in the moonlight. She cried out once, but rough hands caught her and dragged her toward the walls. Ethan had been training with soldiers in the yard when he heard the cry. It was faint, almost lost to the wind, but his heart knew it was Clara. He dropped his blade and ran through the corridors, his steps echoing against the stone. Eyes. He burst into the garden just as the men forced Clara to her knees. One raised a dagger high, ready to strike. Ethan charged without thought, his body moving faster than his mind. Steel met steel as he clashed with the assassins. First fell to his blade with a cry, but the others turned on him at once. They fought with savage force, knowing the queen would never forgive them if they failed. Ethan blocked and struck, his arms burning, his breath sharp in his chest. One slashed across his shoulder, blood running down his arm, but he pushed forward. He would not let Clara die. Not here, not now. Clara crawled back as the fight raged. She watched Ethan move with the fury of a man who had faced war too long to fear it. He fought against three at once, blades flashing in the moonlight. He struck one across the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Another lunged, but Ethan caught his wrist and drove his knife into his throat. The last assassin fought with desperate strength, his blade cutting deep into Ethan's side. Pain shot through him, but he gritted his teeth and forced his sword through the man's chest. When the last enemy fell, Ethan dropped to one knee, blood dripping onto the stones. Clara rushed to him, her hands trembling as she pressed against his wounds. She begged him to stay alive, her voice breaking with fear. Ethan looked at her, his face pale, but his eyes steady. He told her she was safe, and that was enough. Soldiers arrived moments later, drawn by the sound of steel, and they froze at the sight before them. Clara alive, Ethan bloodied but standing, and three assassins lying dead at his feet. When the queen arrived and heard what had happened, her fury shook the fortress. She ordered the traitors dragged from their chambers and executed without mercy. Her generals lowered their heads, ashamed and afraid. She turned to Ethan, her voice filled with fire. She told him that he had saved her daughter not once but twice, and that his blood was proof of his loyalty. She swore before her court that no harm would come to him as long as she ruled. Ethan was carried to his chamber, his wounds treated by the queen's healers. Clara remained by his side through the long night, refusing to leave him. When he awoke, she told him she owed him more than her life. She said her mother would never let him go now, for he had become more than a guest or a prisoner. He had become a shield, a man whose courage bound him to their fate. Ethan listened, silent as always, but inside he knew her words were true. The path ahead was no longer his alone. He was tied to the queen and her daughter, whether he wished it or not. The fortress grew restless in the days after the attack on Clara. The queen's justice had been swift, but the wound of betrayal still lingered in every hall. Guards doubled their watch, and soldiers sharpened their steel with grim faces. Yet the greatest threat was not from within the walls. Riders returned with news that Ethan's homeland had begun to move. His old commanders had gathered an army and were marching toward the fortress. They demanded his release, and they were ready to take it by force. The queen listened to the reports with a face of stone. She called her court together and declared that she would not give Ethan back. She said he had saved her daughter's life and defended her realm with his own blood. No debt could be repaid by letting him go. The generals struck the tables with their fists, shouting their loyalty to her command. The air was thick with the promise of war. Outside the walls, drums already echoed faintly in the distance as the enemy drew closer. Ethan heard the news from Clara. She came to his chamber, her eyes filled with worry. She told him his own people would soon be at the gates, demanding him. Ethan felt a heavy weight in his chest, thought of the men he had fought beside for years, men who trusted him, who had followed him into fire and smoke. Now they marched to face him, not as brothers, but as foes. Clara asked him what he would do. He had no answer. The next day, the fortress shook as the enemy army arrived. Their banners lined the horizon, their campfires burning bright against the night. Horns sounded as their commanders sent a message, demanded Ethan be released before dawn, or they would break the gates and drag him out themselves. The queen stood on the walls with her daughter at her side. She read the demand and tore it in half. She declared that no man would be taken from her by force. Her soldiers roared with approval, their spears lifted high. Inside the fortress, Ethan walked the ramparts, looking out at the vast army beyond. He could see their lines stretching across the hills, thousands ready for war. He felt torn between two worlds. His blood called him to stand with his homeland, but his honor bound him to the queen and Clara. They had trusted him, even when others plotted against him. They had seen him fight and bleed for them. Clara found him on the wall and told him that she believed only he could prevent the slaughter that was about to begin. Her words struck deep, for he knew she spoke the truth. At dawn, the battle began. The enemy advanced with the thunder of drums, their siege engines rolling toward the gates. Arrows darkened the sky as the queen's soldiers loosed their bows. The ground shook as steel clashed and fire roared along the walls. Ethan stood at the front, fighting side by side with the very men who once called him foe. He led charges down the stairs, striking at ladders and cutting down those who tried to climb. His blade moved with the strength of years of war, and his voice carried over the din as he shouted orders that saved lives. The queen watched from the tower, her eyes never leaving him. She saw how her soldiers followed him without question, how they fought harder with him at their side. Clara stood beside her mother, her hands clenched tight, her heart pounding as she prayed he would not fall. Arrows grazed him, stones shattered near him, but still he fought, unyielding. The fortress held through the first assault, and the enemy fell back to regroup. The walls were scarred, the ground littered with the dead, but Ethan still stood. That night, the fortress prepared for another attack. Fires burned in the distance where his old army camped. Inside the walls, soldiers gathered around Ethan, speaking of him with respect. They said he fought like 10 men, that he stood where others would have broken. Even those who once doubted him now looked to him as if he were their own commander. But inside Ethan's heart, the conflict grew sharper. He knew the battle was not only for the fortress, it was for his soul. He had to choose whether he belonged to the land of his birth or to the queen who refused to let him go. As the second dawn rose, the drums began again. The queen placed her hand on his shoulder and told him that he was no longer a stranger in her halls. She said he had become part of her people whether he wished it or not. Clara looked at him with eyes that spoke what words could not. And as the gates shook once more under the blows of war, Ethan knew the moment of choice was close. His sword would decide not only the battle, but the path of his life forever. The second dawn broke with fire in the sky. The enemy army came again with full force, their horns shaking the air, their drums striking like thunder. Their siege towers rolled forward. Their soldiers roared, and the ground trembled as they charged. The fortress walls shook under the weight of the assault. Arrows flew from every side, stones smashed against the gates, and fire spread across the ramparts. The queen's soldiers fought with fury, but the enemy was endless. Ethan stood at the front line with his sword in hand. His armor was battered from the first battle, but his spirit was not broken. He shouted orders, rallying the men when fear threatened to crush them. He moved from wall to wall, striking where the need was greatest. When the enemy ladders rose, he cut them down. When siege rams struck the gates, he led counterattacks to drive them back. He fought like a storm, and the soldiers of the queen followed his lead with unshaken faith. On the tower, Clara watched with her mother. It pounded with every clash, every cry. She saw Ethan stand against men who once called him brother, and she feared he would fall beneath their blades. The queen placed her hand on Clara's shoulder, her face calm though her eyes carried the same worry. She told her daughter that no matter the end, Ethan had already proven who he was. Clara nodded but could not stop the fear from burning in her chest. The enemy pressed harder as the sun rose higher. They brought down one of the outer walls with fire and stone. Queen's soldiers fell back, fighting through smoke and rubble. Ethan stood in the breach, holding it alone until others joined him. He struck down one soldier after another, his sword never slowing. Arrows pierced his armor, blood ran down his arm, yet he did not falter. His voice carried over the roar of battle, and his courage lit a fire in every heart around him. When the gates finally cracked under the ram, the enemy poured inside. The queen's generals feared the fortress was lost, but Ethan led the charge to meet them in the courtyard. The clash was fierce and brutal. Steel rang against steel, men fell screaming, and the ground grew slick with blood. Ethan fought as if his life meant nothing, as if only the survival of the queen and Clara mattered. Soldiers who saw him that day swore he moved like a man born for war, like a blade guided by destiny itself. Clara could no longer watch from the tower. She ran down into the courtyard, against her mother's orders, her heart set only on finding Ethan. She reached him as he cut down another wave of foes. Her presence gave him strength, for he knew he was not fighting for himself, but for her. Together, they rallied the men, pushing the enemy back step by step until the courtyard was theirs again. The queen herself came down at last, her sword in hand, fighting beside her soldiers and showing all that she would not hide behind her throne. As the day burned on, the enemy lines began to break. Their commanders had believed the fortress would fall by noon. But now, it was late afternoon, and still the queen's banner flew high. Ethan seized the moment and led one final charge. He and the soldiers stormed out of the gates, driving the enemy back into the field. The clash was fierce, but the enemy's will had already begun to fail. Men dropped their weapons and fled. The siege was broken, and the queen's fortress stood unbroken. When the field grew quiet, Ethan fell to his knees, his sword still in his hand. Clara rushed to him, catching him before he could collapse. Blood stained his side, but his eyes were steady. The queen stood above him and declared before all that he had not only saved her daughter, but her entire kingdom. She said no man could take him from her, for he belonged to them now by right of blood and honor. The soldiers roared their approval, their voices shaking the air with pride. Ethan looked at Clara, and in her eyes he saw the truth. He was no longer torn between two worlds. His past was gone, and his place was here, with her and with the queen, who had refused to let him go. Though his body was weary, his spirit stood tall. The fortress walls still held, the banners still flew, and the war had given him a new life. He had once been a soldier with no home, but now he was bound to something greater than himself. Nothing would ever break that bond.